Who is the ultimate authority in terms of government legitimacy? Now, in a democratic country, and yes, America is not strictly speaking a pure democracy, but we do utilize democratic processes in our elections and through other means such as ballot referendums at state and local levels. But in democratic government and in limited government, the obvious answer to this is the people. The sole source of legitimacy in terms of the exercise of government power is the will of the people, expressed primarily through elections. But this is a separate issue from the actual process of government. Once you get into the actual halls of Congress and into the legislature and the executive, who is it who gets to determine whether the processes by which bills are actually passed are legitimate or not? And this really is the crux of the matter between Senate leadership and the savaging of Rand Paul in the wake of the extremely brief shutdown which occurred late Thursday night, early Friday morning. Now, Rand Paul is a bit of an extremist in this case because his actions directly led to a temporary government shutdown. However, Rand Paul, in this instance, was actually the only member of Congress standing for regular order. What happened was the Senate was pushing to move forward the vote on the CR and the spending bill in the hopes of avoiding the government shutdown. Rand Paul was asking that the floor be opened up so that he could offer an amendment. Senate leadership said no, because this would mean that we'd have to allow other senators to offer an amendment. And they didn't want to do this because it would take time and essentially it might jeopardize the passage of the bill. So what they wanted to do was do an end run around the normal operating order of the Senate. And this is why they needed unanimous consent of everyone in the chamber to bring the vote forward, which Rand Paul refused to do, and that's why the government temporarily shut down. So, on one side, you have Senate leadership, which is savaging Rand Paul, who is actually the only one who said, let's obey Senate rules and follow the normal operating procedure. Meanwhile, people like John McCain, who are very fond of getting up before the press and the cameras of C-SPAN and making grand sweeping speeches about how the Senate has been utterly corrupted and how it doesn't do anything through order and process anymore, were totally silent on this issue when you would think that they would stand with Rand Paul in light of this argument. Now, the procedural moves of the Senate are something that the Senate has autonomy to control. So on the one hand, you could say that what the Senate did in this case, and it's sort of running roughshod over normal operating Senate procedure, isn't really that big a deal, because what they were ultimately trying to do is keep government functioning, and obviously this is the very basic fundamental goal of politics. It's the process of governing. And so we find ourselves in this weird situation where disobeying normal rule and order is dysfunction and leads to a failure of politics in the sense that it means that government's not occurring, whereas ignoring the normal rules means that government is not occurring and politics is dysfunctional. Now, while that one might make one sympathetic to the case of Senate leadership who termed what Paul did grandstanding and ultimately pointless because it didn't get a result, the question then becomes, if this is the case and the normal senatorial procedures for holding debate and passing a bill are such an impediment to legislation, why doesn't the Senate go through and change them? Right, this is a very valid question in terms of reconciliation. The Senate has what is called the Byrd Rule, which dictates essentially what aspects of a bill make it qualified to pass through reconciliation and thus be subject to passage by a 51 vote threshold rather than the 60 vote threshold, which means that filibustering can occur. Now, often and particularly President Trump and some other members of the Senate who have been frustrated by Senate Republican leadership's inability to get anything done without getting around that 60-vote threshold, have argued for the nuclear option, which would mean that the filibuster would go away and that a simple majority would pass legislation. Now, the filibuster is another check on power, so getting rid of it is probably not the wisest idea. But again, if our standard is the basic political function, the basic ability to govern, it might be a feasible solution if we just ignore the grander context of the separation of powers and system of checks and balances, which helps make government not a threat to the citizenry. So we're not really thinking about the citizenry here. We're just thinking about government functions and internal government procedures and how we can make them function more effectively, because clearly they don't right now. But if that's the case, and the question then becomes, well, why not just change the Byrd rule? Because the Senate does have authority to change these things. Again, they'd have to go through a vote, but again, it is a Democratic body. And at least in that case, we would have a veneer of democracy versus Senate leadership saying, no, we're not going to do things this way and just shutting debate down, which doesn't look good, even if it is ultimately in the greater interest of a functioning politics and a functioning government. But these are not debates that we ever have. There seems to be this sense that the Senate doesn't have any agency over itself. And if you follow politics at all, and if you followed either the debate over the healthcare bill or the tax bill, you probably heard about the Senate parliamentarian. And the Senate parliamentarian, in a very simplified sense, is kind of like a research librarian. The Senate parliamentarian's job is to look into the rules of operation which the Senate has passed and to make a decision on whether or not the Senate is within the right to act in a certain way. The Senate parliamentarian, who's currently a woman, does things like alerts Senate leadership if a bill is subject to reconciliation or not. Now, the Senate parliamentarian is not an elected representative and has no real political power. So in some instances, you have the Senate deferring to the judgment of the parliamentarian in what could be construed as political matters, in actual partisan motivated matters. And again, because the Senate parliamentarian has no power, effectively the Senate leadership doesn't have to obey what the Senate parliamentarian says, providing they change whatever rule the Senate parliamentarian is citing. So again, the Senate has agency to change these kind of things. They could change the scope of the Byrd rule just as easily as they could get rid of the filibuster and go nuclear. And yet you only hear the one and not the other. And the question is, why don't we hear more about this debate, right? Because there is this sense, even within the Senate, that, and in the House to some extent too, but the Senate is where a lot more drama has gone on lately, so we're focusing on that. Is particularly this kerfuffle between Rand Paul and John Thune and Mitch McConnell and other members of Republican Senate leadership is effectively, it's a little bit about issues, but it's most fundamentally about the regular operating order of the Senate and the fact that the Senate does not feel that it needs to obey its own rules when they've dug themselves into a political hole that they need to get out of at the last minute. And that seems to be a problem, because then you get Senate leadership who sits there and says, well, we had to do this because we didn't have a choice. It was a last-minute bill. It was exigent. And of course they ignore that this is a crisis of their own making. But beyond that, if that's the case, then how come there's not any follow-through on that, in a sense that, well, the rules that we have don't function for our political situation, which has changed a little bit since the first manual for Senate behavior was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, then Vice President and thus President of the Senate. But this isn't a debate that goes on at all today. And one might ask why, because it seems like it is a debate that should be had. Clearly, the normal rules are not working for the process by which the Senate currently operates under. Clearly, there's a lot more fly-by-night, seat-of-the-pants kind of stuff going on. And the normal Senate order does not speak well to this. Now, it doesn't speak well to this because that's not how legislation is meant to be done. Politics in a democratic government and in our separation of powers is meant to be messy, slow, and fractious so that we don't pass last-minute compendium bills that are of questionable benefit to the long-term health of the country. But again, the Senate has autonomy over its own operations. So if it wanted to change the procedure by which it operates and avoid these situations, it could. So how come we're not even having this debate, I think, is a valid question.